It was 2 in the morning when the front door exploded off its hinges. Flashlights cut through the darkness, boots thundered across the hardwood, and voices barked commands no one could understand. A black man bolted upright in bed, his heart pounding, his mind racing. Was this a robbery? A mistake? Or something far worse? Before he could even speak, armed cops swarmed his home, shouting for him to get on the ground. But when one officer's flashlight swept across the wall and froze on a framed judge's robe, everything stopped cold. By day, he was the kind of man you trust to settle disputes, interpret laws, and hand down justice with a steady hand. Judge Malcolm Hayes had worked his entire life for the quiet dignity that came with his black robe and the respect it commanded in court. But outside the courthouse, he was simply a husband, a father, and a man who liked to tend his garden on weekends. His neighbors saw him jogging in the mornings, carrying groceries in the afternoons, and waving politely from his porch. Nothing about him suggested danger or criminality. Yet for Malcolm, there was always an unspoken truth lingering in the air. Being a black man in America meant never fully escaping suspicion. He knew it the moment he left the courthouse without his robe, when a police cruiser slowed just a little too long behind his car, or when a store clerk's eyes tracked him more closely than the next customer. He wore the robe of authority, but his skin color often dictated how strangers treated him before they ever knew his name. That night, he had gone to bed later than usual. Case files still sat open on his desk, but exhaustion pulled him away. His wife was out of town visiting family, the house unnervingly quiet, save for the ticking of the clock in the hallway. Before closing his eyes, he had paused in his study, letting his gaze rest on the framed robe hanging neatly on the wall. To him, it wasn't just a symbol of his career, it was a reminder of every struggle he had overcome. Every insult ignored, every hurdle cleared, every exam passed when the odds were stacked against him. The robe represented his triumph, but it also symbolized protection. Or so he thought. At 2 a.m., Judge Hayes slept deeply, unaware that his name had been mistakenly tied to a violent suspect through a sloppy police report and a rushed briefing. Somewhere across town, an officer had transposed numbers on an address. Somewhere else, a team of tactical officers had been told to expect an armed and dangerous black male. And as those men rode silently through the night, their minds filled with images of danger, Judge Hayes lay vulnerable in his own bed, believing that walls and locks made him safe. The irony was cruel. The man who interpreted the law, defended the Constitution, and demanded evidence in his courtroom would soon find himself treated as though none of those principles mattered. To the police about to break down his door, he wasn't a judge, a father, or a citizen deserving of rights. He was just another silhouette in the dark, another target. And as the seconds ticked toward that fateful moment, Judge Hayes stirred faintly in his sleep, unaware that his greatest trial was about to begin. The first sound was so violent it ripped him from his sleep. A deafening crack as wood splintered and the front door slammed against the wall. Judge Hayes shot upright, confusion flooding his mind. For a split second, he thought it was a nightmare. But the heavy thud of boots storming through his hallway told him otherwise. "Police! Get down! Get down now!" The voices were sharp, commanding, and terrifying. Flashlights flickered like lightning through the house, cutting across family photos and framed diplomas. Shadows of armed men stretched across the walls, multiplying with every step they took deeper into his home. Hayes stumbled out of bed, his heart pounding so hard it hurt. What is happening?" His voice cracked with disbelief, but the officers didn't hear him, or maybe they didn't care. The thundering footsteps grew closer. He reached for the bedside lamp, and in that instant a beam of light cut across his face. A blinding flashlight locked on him. "There! He's in here!" Before he could move, 3 officers burst into the bedroom, rifles raised. "Get on the ground! Hands where we can see him!" Hayes froze, his hands trembling in the air. His bare feet pressed against the cold hardwood floor as his mind raced. He had lectured countless young men in his courtroom about staying calm during police encounters, about surviving the moment. And now, that advice echoed inside his own head like a cruel warning. I'm a judge," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's been some mistake." "Down!" "Now," one officer barked, stepping forward. Two others rushed past, sweeping the closet, the bathroom, the corners of the room as if he were hiding weapons in his own home. Another officer kicked aside a chair, flipping over books and scattering papers from his desk. Every instinct in Hayes screamed at him to argue, to demand a warrant, to assert his rights. But the black metal barrels aimed inches from his chest silenced him. One wrong move, one wrong word, and the night could end with a headline instead of a hearing. Down the hall, drawers were being yanked open, cabinets slammed shut. The chaos spread like fire through every room. Family heirlooms shattered. His wife's favorite vase lay in pieces. The quiet home that once felt like a sanctuary was being violated, stripped of dignity with every careless boot print. Hayes knelt slowly, pressing his palms flat against the floor, his robe of authority replaced with pajamas and fear. Sweat ran down his temple as the realization sank in: these men didn't see him. They didn't recognize his face from press photos or courthouse announcements. To them, he wasn't Judge Hayes. He was just another black man in a dark house. Then, the shouting suddenly faltered. "Wait, hold on. What's that?" One officer's flashlight swept across the study wall. Amid the wreckage of toppled papers and broken glass, the beam caught on a framed garment, the stark black of a judge's robe. Next to it hung a certificate bearing the gold seal of the state, his name printed in bold, Honorable Malcolm Hayes. The room fell eerily quiet. The officers exchanged glances, their bravado cracking. Guns lowered a fraction, hesitation creeping into their posture. The tension that had filled the house now shifted, heavy, confused, dangerous in a different way. Judge Hayes remained on the floor, chest heaving, eyes locked on the men who just invaded his life. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The robe on the wall spoke louder than anything he could say. The silence in the room was suffocating. For the first time since the raid began, the shouting stopped. All that remained was the echo of heavy breathing, the judge's ragged, fearful gasps, and the uneasy exhales of armed men realizing something was wrong. The flashlight beam lingered on the framed robe, its black fabric absorbing the light like a shadow that couldn't be erased. Next to it, the certificate glared back at them with authority: State of Georgia, judicial appointment of the Honorable Malcolm Hayes. Judge, one officer muttered under his breath, as if the word itself weighed more than his vest. His grip on the rifle loosened ever so slightly. Another officer hissed, "Keep your eyes on him. Don't let him move." Hayes stayed frozen on the floor, his hands spread wide against the hardwood. Every nerve in his body screamed to get up, to reclaim his dignity, but instinct told him to stay still. He had seen too many lives snuffed out in an instant because someone misread a movement. "I told you," he said, voice trembling but steady enough to carry across the room, "I'm a judge. This is my house. You've made a mistake." The lead officer shifted uneasily, his jaw tight beneath his helmet. He had trained for raids, for shootouts, for violent confrontations, but not for this. Not for storming into the home of a man whose signature carried the power to shape their futures in court. "Sir," the officer finally said, softer than before, "stand up slowly." But Hayes didn't move. His eyes narrowed. "Do you have a warrant?" The words landed like a gavel strike. Simple. Sharp. Impossible to ignore. The officers exchanged glances. No one answered. The silence was confirmation enough. "Because if you don't," Hayes continued, his voice rising with each word, "then this entire operation is illegal. Every second you stay in this house, you're breaking the very laws you swore to uphold." The men shifted uncomfortably. The confidence that had fueled their midnight raid now evaporated under the cold light of accountability. One officer lowered his weapon completely, his eyes flicking toward the floor. Another stepped back, as if distance might shield him from what was unfolding. Hayes pushed himself onto his knees, his hands still visible. "Do you know how many times I've sat in courtrooms and warned officers about reckless policing? About cutting corners? About what happens when you treat people like suspects instead of citizens? His voice carried a strength now, the same commanding tone he used in court. The trembling fear that gripped him moments ago was hardening into something else, righteous fury. You broke into the wrong home. You terrorized an innocent man at 2 in the morning. And the only reason you're hesitating now, his eyes flicked toward the robe on the wall, is because you suddenly realize I'm not just any black man. I'm the one who can hold you accountable. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. None of the officers spoke. The bravado of the raid was gone, replaced with an unspoken question that lingered in every heart: what if he hadn't been a judge? Hayes rose slowly to his feet. The barrels of their rifles dipped further down, the men now more afraid of paperwork and consequences than of the man standing before them. In that charged silence, Judge Malcolm Hayes stood taller, the authority of the robe behind him even if it wasn't on his shoulders. He had turned the tables without moving an inch. But this standoff wasn't over. Not yet. For a moment, time itself seemed suspended in that bedroom. Judge Hayes stood, his chest heaving, sweat dripping from his temple, yet his voice carried the kind of authority no weapon could match. The officers remained motionless, caught between instinct and realization, their rifles lowered but still in hand. The robe on the wall loomed over all of them, a silent witness to the chaos, a symbol that cut deeper than any badge in the room. Finally, one officer spoke. This can't be right." His words cracked, betraying doubt. The lead officer barked back, more out of desperation than confidence, "Stay focused. We're not done here." But even he knew the raid had already collapsed. There was no warrant. No probable cause. No justification left to cling to. The second they recognized the name Honorable Malcolm Hayes, everything shifted. Hayes stepped forward deliberately, his hands still visible. Each move was calculated, deliberate, like a judge pacing a courtroom. "You came into my home without a warrant. You pointed guns at me while I slept. You destroyed my property. You violated the Constitution you swore to protect. And now," he paused, locking eyes with the officer in charge, "you've realized exactly who I am." The room vibrated with tension. None of the officers dared respond. "I could order you all arrested right now," Hayes said, his tone like thunder rolling across the floorboards. "Obstruction. Trespassing. Assault with a deadly weapon. Do you understand the weight of what you've done?" The youngest officer, his face pale beneath his helmet, stammered, We were told this was the right address." Suspect was armed, dangerous. Hayes cut him off. "And did anyone verify that information? Or did you just break into the first black man's house you found?" Silence again. No one had an answer. The judge's words pierced deeper than bullets. He wasn't just defending himself now, he was cross-examining them in real time, turning the raid into a courtroom drama where they were the defendants. The lead officer's grip on his rifle faltered. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered it completely. The others followed, weapons pointing to the floor, their eyes avoiding Hayes's. "Get out," Hayes ordered, his voice steady as steel. No one moved. "I said get out." His voice rose, echoing through the house like a gavel striking down order. The command shattered whatever resolve the officers had left. One by one, they began backing out of the room, their heavy boots suddenly sounding clumsy against the wood. The adrenaline that had fueled their midnight invasion drained, leaving only shame in its wake. But Hayes wasn't finished. He stepped forward, his presence filling the space they were retreating from. "Don't think this ends here. You'll answer for every second of this night, in reports, in hearings, and if necessary, in court." By the time they reached the front door, their raid team looked less like warriors and more like men caught trespassing. No words were exchanged, no apologies muttered. Just the sound of the night swallowing them as they disappeared into the darkness they came from. Judge Hayes stood in the wreckage of his home, the cool night air rushing through the broken doorframe. His heart still pounded, his body still trembled, but his spirit was unbroken. The robe on the wall stared back at him, a reminder of the power of justice, and the fragility of life without it. The raid was over. But the fight for accountability had only just begun. The night ended with broken locks, shattered wood, and a silence so heavy it pressed against the walls. Judge Hayes stood alone in the wreckage, his breathing finally slowing, though his chest still rose and fell with the echoes of adrenaline. The robe still hung on the wall, perfectly still, untouched by the chaos around it. For Malcolm Hayes, that robe was more than fabric. It was a shield. And tonight, it might have been the only thing that kept him alive. When the first light of dawn crept through the windows, the house no longer felt like his sanctuary. It was a crime scene, only this time, the crime had been committed by those sworn to uphold the law. Hayes photographed everything, the broken frame of his front door, the shattered vase, the papers strewn across the floor. His training as a lawyer and judge had taught him a simple truth: documentation was power. If the raid team thought the night would disappear into shadows, they were gravely mistaken. By noon, word of the raid had already spread through the courthouse. Colleagues whispered in hallways, clerks exchanged rumors, and reporters caught wind that something had gone terribly wrong. It didn't take long before a statement from the police department arrived, carefully worded, filled with phrases like mistaken address, unfortunate error, and no harm intended. But Hayes knew better. He had presided over enough cases to see through legal smokescreens. This wasn't an error. This was negligence. This was recklessness. And had he not been a judge, had that robe not been hanging on his wall, he might have been another tragic name in the news, another black man whose life ended in the dead of night, written off as a misunderstanding. He filed formal complaints immediately. Within days, an internal affairs investigation was underway. The lead officer was suspended. The department scrambled to present a narrative that minimized the damage, but the facts were undeniable: there had been no warrant, no proper verification, and no justification for breaking into his home. In the weeks that followed, Hayes stood at the center of a storm. News outlets ran the story nationwide. Civil rights groups rallied behind him, pointing to his case as proof of systemic failure. For once, the victim wasn't voiceless, he was a judge, and his testimony carried the weight of authority few could dismiss. Yet even with the public pressure, Hayes felt a gnawing bitterness. Justice might come for him because of who he was. But what about everyone else? What about the countless men and women who didn't have robes or certificates on their walls to protect them? Late one evening, after another long day of fielding calls and statements, Hayes returned to the study. He sat in his chair, staring at the robe framed on the wall. The house was repaired, the locks replaced, but the sense of safety never fully returned. Still, he found a strange resolve in that fabric. They froze when they saw the robe, he murmured to himself. But they should have stopped the moment they saw a man. That thought became his mission. Hayes began pushing for reforms: stronger oversight on warrants, mandatory verification protocols, accountability measures that couldn't be buried under paperwork. He used his platform not only to demand justice for himself but to force a conversation the system had long tried to avoid. The raid at 2 a.m. had shaken him to his core, but it had also reminded him of something vital: titles shouldn't be what saves a person's life. Dignity and safety should belong to every citizen. And as the robe watched over him from its frame, Judge Malcolm Hayes silently vowed that no door, in any neighborhood, should ever be kicked in again without justice standing on the threshold. The night Judge Malcolm Hayes's door was kicked in will never leave him. The sound of boots, the blinding flashlights, the cold metal barrels pointed at his chest, all of it remains etched in memory. But what will haunt him more than anything is this: the officers only stopped when they saw his robe. That single detail carried a chilling truth. Authority, status, and power had shielded him in a way that ordinary citizens could never rely on. For every judge, lawyer, or official who survives such encounters, how many ordinary fathers, brothers, or sons don't? Hayes rebuilt his home, but he also built something bigger: a fight for change. He turned his personal nightmare into a public reckoning, demanding accountability from the very system he had spent his career defending. And while his robe may have saved him that night, his mission became making sure others didn't need one to survive. Because justice, he realized, shouldn't hang on a wall, it should live in every street, every neighborhood, every home. And so the question lingers, one that no badge, no press statement, and no courtroom ruling can erase. If he hadn't been a judge, would he even be alive to tell the story?